Hi, I'm Kate.
And I'm Jen.
And this is Chamomile and Clove, our All Souls podcast. Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome to 2018, the year when we will get to see the All Souls TV series on screen for the first time. We are here today to discuss chapters 25, 26, and 27 of A Discovery of Witches.
Yes, and we are going to do a little bit of discussion, and at the end we're going to pop in some listener feedback because we decided we don't have a lot of notes on these three chapters, and I think that's partly because not a lot of time goes by in these three chapters. I think it's about a day and a half maybe that's covered in these chapters. So, and there is not a lot to talk about that we haven't already covered in some of the other chapters. So we're going to pop in some feedback at the end of this recording.
Right.
Great.
So the chapter breakdown is as follows. Essentially, while Matthew is back in Oxford, Diana is spending time alone at the chateau with Isabeau and Mart, and she goes up to Matthew's office to do some work. She is looking for a paper and a pen with which to take notes on the Auroric insurgents when she discovers that there is a secret drawer in Matthew's desk. She opens that drawer and discovers the seals for the Knights of Lazarus, and then begins sort of an excavation of Matthew's library to find evidence of this chivalric order that has apparently had its fingers in lots of little pots for a very long time. And we engage in a little bit of historical conspiracy theories and some romping around in the Templars, and then we come back and essentially Matthew has decided to return to Sator and to return to Diana. He decides that nothing can be done about Peter Knox, and he is coming back to her. She waits for him at Septur and flies out into his arms. There is some kissy, some squeezy, some very disapproving commentary and looks from Isabeau, and then they basically spend the evening catching up together and becoming more romantically entwined, and they actually spend the evening with Matthew and Diana sharing a bed for the first time, although not consummating the relationship. Literally just the sight of Matthew in pajamas is apparently enough to send Diana just like headlong into swoony time. So then the next day she decides that she's going to assert her agency by making Matthew feed himself. So she goes hunting with him, and we have a repetition of the hunting scene, but seeing the differences between Matthew and his mother, and how they react to hunger, to predation, to instinct, etc., so on and so forth. And Diane has some cheese sandwiches, and then basically we come home.
Yeah.
So
that's about it.
Where would you like to start today? What do you think sort of strikes you about these three chapters?
Well, I think one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit is in these three chapters, we get a little bit of retconning of things that happened in our last discussion before Matthew left. So we are going to talk about how the view of things has changed in the last 48 hours in the book. And retcon, for those of you who don't know, is retroactive continuity. So it's when something happens earlier in your book or series, and then later in the book or series, you fudge it a little bit to either make it into something that it wasn't before, or just pretend like it never happened. That is a retcon. You see it frequently in TV shows and in books and in movies. So we do get a little bit of a relationship retconning in these chapters that we can talk about. Yes. Yeah.
From a critical perspective, what do you think about retconning? I mean, do you have an opinion of whether it's ever successful, or do you think that this is just an instance where the scaffolding is very noticeable?
I think retconning can be successful, and I think a lot of times reasons why it happens is something will be present in, for example, a TV show or a longer book series very early on, and then the writers will make a decision in a later season or in a later book to turn that earlier insignificant thing into something that's important or much more significant than it was previously. And you see that in Harry Potter. You see it in TV quite a lot, actually, if you pay attention. And I think that's just a product of like developing the story and developing the ideas. When you start writing a story, no writer knows absolutely every single thing that's going to happen and writes it down, to the letter in their story. Things evolve as you create them. And so I think a lot of retconning in the most successful ways is just an evolution of a story or an idea. In this case, I don't think, to me, it is not as successful as some other situations, because what we get in this particular situation is more of a pretending something didn't happen that did actually happen, which I think is when retconning is less successful most of the time. What do you think about it?
I agree. I think that particularly when an author or a creator makes a choice to try to get you to change the way you felt about a prior scene, or to have like a deliberate read on it that is maybe not what you initially got from the scene or from the content itself, it can create a little bit of sort of cognitive dissonance as you're reading. It's like, wait, weren't we just talking about like this was important 30 pages ago and now we sort of dispensed with it? I think for me, the difficult part with these chapters in part is their pacing, right? The pacing is super, super weird here. But we also do this really dramatic thing with Diana's emotions when she experiences the witch water. And then essentially just in like one fell swoop, Matthew coming back resolves that conflict, and it sort of stalls, right? I mean, the momentum of the book just sort of like sits in a place where the good news is we don't spend a lot of time in the will they or won't they. This isn't, sort of a tortured, like these people might not end up together sort of a thing. We resolve that relatively quickly, but in doing so, we also lose some of the conflict, I think, because maybe, as we're reading, Diana thinks to some extent the conflict has been resolved. I do think that that's part of it. But we are in a situation where it seems like we went from some things being life or death to really nothing is life or death. And that I find to be just a hard place to be at the midpoint of a book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you'll find, authors will say a lot of things about, retcons in their books and make commentary on things. And if you remember our last kind of listener feedback in where we talked about a little bit more about literary criticism, that we generally ascribe to death of the author, which is that if an author says something later on after the work is published and it isn't supported in the text, then we don't necessarily buy into it as much. And my example of that is Harry Potter. So if you've read the Harry Potter books or even seen the movie series, spoilers, I guess, for Harry Potter, the evolution of the Horcruxes in the Harry Potter series. So in the first couple of books, you have these items that seem to be only important to the single plot of this book, like the diary, for example, the ring. And then eventually we find out in later books, those are all Horcruxes and pieces of Voldemort's soul, whereas in the early books, they are textually not that. And later on, they are retconned to become that, which I think is brilliant, and I have no problem with it. But then you might have the author, come back and say, "Oh, that was always the intention." But if you look at the book, it's not textually supported that was the original intention, which is fine, And I think the Horcrux is an example of like a really successful retcon in fiction, actually. So even if we have the scene and, maybe Deb comes and says, like, it was always intended to be that way, I don't buy it.
And I think that the series as a whole does manage to successfully retcon some things much, much later in books 2 and 3 in ways that are absolutely convincing and contextualize rather than...
Right over.
Right. That contextualize rather than override, other parts of the series. And that's really, really successful. And perhaps the difficulty here is just the first person narrative and the fact that Diana doesn't really have a good grasp on what's going on, because it seems like our conflict keeps going in and out of focus, and perhaps that is why I find these chapters so difficult to engage with, because we are in some ways resolving the sort of big C romantic conflict, because at this point it's like, well, Matthew and Diana are together. Woof. Right? Now, that's not to say that they don't have romantic conflict in terms of like how will we actually be and do in this relationship, but we're losing sight of the larger conflict, which is about, you know, the world of creatures and the book. And that's partially because we sort of like send Matthew away to deal with the central narrative conflict, while Diana like fritters away in France and fights with her soon-to-be mother-in-law. Like, we just do this thing, and like when stuff happens with the central narrative conflict and your protagonist isn't present, that's not great storycraft. Like, it's fine. Other than that, imagine that the central narrative conflict is like a lighthouse with a beacon, and we are losing it every time it like flips around. You know, we're not actually getting closer to the lighthouse. And that is a frustrating place to be for me structurally. And that's not to say that books can't have sort of an ebb and flow and a pacing thing, but this set of chapters feels like a real stalling of the conflict, or like we don't have to worry about that because we're dealing with this other thing. And it's especially frustrating because there are chapters where it feels like we are dealing with both of them at the same time in a really efficient and effective way.
Right. Yeah. So do you want to talk about chapter 25? The library.
I mean, that's what we're here to do,
yeah,
right?
That's what we're here to do. Okay, so we have Diana's in there. She's doing some work on Aurora to distract herself, whichever. She looks for paper. Matthew doesn't have any paper. Guys, he's got all these pens and pencils, but nothing to write on. I don't know. Like, just go with it, I guess. Lots of fancy pens and pencils and office supplies, but no paper. Thus begins our search for, you know, paper and blotting paper and whatever.
Secret
we drop
societies.
The pen. Secret societies. We find the secret drawer, and, you know, like you do with your boyfriend's things, you break into it. Yes, like you do. My most... I just like have to like laugh because it's so like absurd to me. You know, Diana's on the floor and she's got this secret drawer and she's like considering breaking into her boyfriend's, you know, property to snoop around, as in all healthy relationships. And she has that comment where she's like, oh, you know, snooping Matthew's personal life, that was fine, but defacing an antique was not. And I was like, okay, perhaps we need to re-examine our ethics a little bit.
Or there's that part where she's also like, well, he rifled through my stuff, so that's fine.
Tit for tat. Right? Like,
tit for tat is also a healthy romantic relationship strategy.
Totally. 100%.
Not at all.
Yeah. How does this work for you as a device to discover the Knights of Because I feel like it does a lot of relationship damage while furthering Matthew's mystery, you know, the mystery of Matthew, like that plot line. But like, we do a lot of relationship damage in the process of finding out about the Knights of Lazarus. Like, I legitimately would have much rather had her pull down a random volume from the shelf and be like, what's this? Because she's already curious about his library, and then have her discover the Knights of Lazarus, rather than this like whole intrusion into personal property thing that we're doing.
Right. I agree with you. I would much prefer, like, in my rewritten version of this scene, she is snooping through, like, individual texts. You know, in fact, it would have been fabulous to combine this with the origin of the species sort of library scene, have the ledger fall out bonker on the head, just as like a comic callback to Ashmole 782, like just have it be sort of like, you know, like she pulls down one book and then the ledger falls out and she's like, gee, Elizabeth I seems to have gotten a lot of money from someone, I wonder, and have Matthew forced to explain it to her, basically, I think would be a more compelling way to deal with that aspect of his secrecy and of his past. I feel like, I mean, to be fair, I am not nearly as critical of the Secret Society Knights Templar thing as a lot of other readers are. I actually think it's kind of fun, and so long as I'm in a historical fiction / contemporary romance paranormal romp through the centuries with Diana and Matthew, I am perfectly happy to add some, chivalric orders to the mix. Like, that makes it a slightly like shinier, dustier cocktail than I was expecting, but okay, cool, I'm along for it. I don't particularly like the Nancy Drew and the case of the missing drawer part of this.
No. I think it's really problematic, and we've already done that with Matthew and Diana, and I feel like we could be developing their relationship and putting more trust in, where what we're in fact doing is removing trust on both sides, like at an exponential rate. And it's really problematic.
And it would be so much better to do this, as I said, like with that, say, origin of the species scene, which, though it comes earlier, there is a version of this book where it maybe comes a little bit later. And you force Matthew and Diana to have another conversation like they did at the diner, where you force them to like sit across the table from one another and like actually wrestle with things, and actually have hard conversations with one another. That is a better, sort of, for me, more mature version of this scene. And especially like what we learn later about, vampires and territoriality in 26, like I also don't buy that she's like snooping around, spreading her like green witchiness on everything, and he doesn't sniff it out. Like, we don't really deal with the fact that she knows about the Knights of Lazarus until much, much later. What I do like about the device of the Knights of Lazarus is that it sort of tightens the noose around Matthew in particular and his relationship with the wider world of creatures and with the congregation. I think that it adds this additional layer of conflict and complication to understanding his behavior vis-a-vis, the Noxes and other creatures of the world.
I like the device of the Knights of Lazarus quite a lot. And I am someone who frequently has difficulty with historical tourism in fiction, like knowing all the famous people that were alive when you were alive thing. I have a big problem with that, and when we get to book 2, I'm going to talk about it a lot. But the Knights of Lazarus, for me, in these books, is one of the most successful integrations of historical tourism, because I completely buy in that a vampire who is from very wealthy and renowned vampire family and has been around for 1,500 years would indeed be a member of a chivalric order and is now the head of it because he's 1,500 years old. I totally buy into that, and I really like it as a plot device as we go through the books. So, and I like that he's the head of it, because I think that provides a lot of stuff for us, later in this book and as we go into, the other 2 books. So I like it.
The other thing I like about it is that, so I like this read on the whole conspiracy theory thing, right? Where it's like, yes, all of this would be too complicated for one lifetime, but for one creature with the equivalent of like 150 lifetimes, like there is a lot more subtle maneuvering, and that engagement. Like, I think the parts of later books where we deal with like the historical tourism are actually enhanced by the Knights of Lazarus aspect, because I can buy the interaction, say, of a very powerful, moneyed, like chivalric order with the important people who might need to rely on either the order's knowledge or its connections or its money. Like, I can buy that as a linking device, as opposed to as like it doesn't seem to me to necessarily elevate Matthew or his family to an undue level of importance. Maybe I'm not articulating this correctly, but it's not like catapulting them into they are actually royalty. It's more like it is placing them in a position where you understand to some extent why Matthew sort of believes that if he just like steps in and manages everything,
that
it'll all
be
go
fine.
away.
Yeah.
Like, I think that that's actually very supportive of his characterization here, that he thinks that he can just put his foot down and make it stop.
Yeah, exactly. I really enjoy the conspiracy theory, you know, with the Knights Templar. I think that's very nice and clever. I mean, it doesn't, as far as like plot goes, it does not do very much, but I enjoy it from a historical perspective.
Well, it also does a nice thing where it's like, if you hadn't done that and we're living in a world in which there were Templars, but we haven't addressed why they don't still exist and the Knights of Lazarus do, I think that that would be weird. So it's it's a very tidy way to be like, no, this is the order that has survived time. On 321, I was captivated today by the image of Diana after she has picked up the seal and she's holding it and her palm is impressed with the flared cross, the crescent moon and star, and the fleur-de-lis. And I like that as a visual. I like it as a foreshadowing device. And I like it as, I think, as a metaphor. Maybe we can talk about it later.
When we get more of those things.
When we get more of those things and when we get more development for Diana and things that happen to her. But I would actually like to put a note next to this and come back and talk about it when we talk about like impressions and markings and like changes to the body and what it means to like carry someone's symbol, right? Like I think that that's really juicy and meaty, and we will get to it later.
Right. Yes. And we spend a whole chapter on this.
Yes.
And we do, you know, in the in-between spaces get an overview again of Matthew's library and all of his old things. And I'm not sure that we need to spend an entire chapter on it. And it's fine. But, you know, like this is 3 chapters and it's, like we said, it's maybe like a day and a half of actual time that passes in these 3 chapters. So, but again, as we've discussed, but like structurally, time in this book is a little bit wobbly, particularly here in the middle of the book. It's difficult structurally.
It's difficult structurally, and I also think that, I think that the scaffolding that the chapter puts under the Knights of Lazarus is fine. Like, that part is fine. Diana's introspection and the time that she spends sort of navel-gazing about Matthew is not a successful, number one, because I don't think it's very confident storytelling. Like, on page 327, we go through essentially half a page where Diana is just recapping, in case you haven't been paying attention, like all of the challenges that face her if she decides to be with Matthew. And I think that that just speaks to a little bit of insecurity, and maybe whether that's Diana's insecurity or whether it's authorial insecurity about like, hey, are you getting this? Are you following me? I don't find that to be terribly successful, especially when we get stuff like on 326. The enormity of what it meant to love a vampire struck home as I slid the account book back into the shelf. It was not just his age that posed the difficulties, or his dining habits, or the fact that he had killed humans and would do so again. It was the secrets. And I have an exclamation point next to that because I'm like, some of those things are maybe more important than the secrets. And the emphasis that we place on the secrets, I think, is deliberate because we don't want to engage with the more difficult parts of that. With the, but we're not, and we're not.
I mean, you're right. She is. It's all introspection, and it's not anything that we haven't gotten from her before. Like we've already talked about all this before. It's fine. And I should say too, writing is hard, you guys. Writing a novel is really, really difficult. Writing 3 novels is exponentially more difficult. Writing a story that takes place over 3 books while still being self-contained in each book is really, really difficult. And we're kind of We don't want to seem like we're Monday morning quarterbacking this at all, to use a little sports ball metaphor. Sports ball. Because obviously we didn't write the book, and it's very easy to come in and say, oh, this is what I would change and this is what I would do to make it better to me. But it's quite another thing to go in and write it and, you know, have your character in this place where you're like, okay, well, how does she find out about the Knights of, you know, how does this all come about, you know? And if you sit down and look at that plot wise, you're like, I have this character and she is in the study. How does she find out about the Knights of Lazarus, you know? And actually being in that place is much, much more difficult than coming in and saying, you know, this is what we would do.
Oh, for sure. And, you know, the position that we come from, I think, or at least speaking for myself, is that the more that I engage with this story, there are aspects of it that I fall more deeply in love with every time that I do it. And the story has really, really, really good bones. And it is an incredible work in scope and in heft and in where it ends up. And so I am 100,000% here for all the places that the story ends up. But I think that by giving it a really critical, close read, because I like stories and I like to talk about what works and what doesn't, that we have both a better understanding of what is really, really great and successful in the story and the stuff that just doesn't land as well. I mean, that is not to say that it decreases the value, importance, or worthiness of the work, just simply that sometimes there are bits that don't stick the landing, and that, you know, you can honor the work and love the work and recognize the blood, sweat, and tears that went into the work and still give it a critical read, which it deserves, because it's a good work of fiction, and every good work of fiction, every medium, in my opinion, deserves a hard think.
And I think, and we both do it from a place of like, we really love these books. We really love the characters. Obviously, we're doing a podcast about it. And the podcast is not just to like, you know, bang on about like how bad they are, because we obviously don't think that they're bad. It's just, I think for me and probably for Kate, like it helps me appreciate it more than just like a surface read of it. And I thought it was just important to bring it up because the middle of this book is so difficult to talk about from like a literary criticism, you know, viewpoint that we tend to take on the show. And the way that we're unpacking all these characters in the story, this part of the book is really difficult to do and be positive, which is, you know, a balance that we're trying to find. So I thought it was important just to mention, you know, like all of this is very difficult to do in actuality, to write this kind of thing. So, and we're not, you know, trying to be down on Deb or anything. It's just, you know, the perspective that we happen to be taking, and we love these books, and I totally respect Deb as an author and, you know, as a creator and the world that she's created. So anyway.
And I think it's just so difficult because this midpoint it's really hard to stick your finger on where we hit the real middle of the story. And it is hard from this perspective to see where the book will end up, like what shape it is going to take, because it sort of starts and looks like it's going to take one shape, and that shape is we're going to spend the entire first book dealing with the Matthew and Diana romance. That is where I think I would have anticipated the story would go based on the first 20 or so chapters. And then we get into these chapters and it seems like that thread has been snipped or knotted off. We are not going to do that story. We are doing another story. And the challenge is the number of stories that we're trying to manage at the same time. And so that's very, very difficult. And this just happens to be, I think, the place in the story where it is the most fraught. Because
we're juggling all of these things here in the middle of Act 2 of all of our conflicts. And juggling is hard. We have a lot of things to juggle. So, and now we have our characters in two different places, like we said. So, you know, that's rough. And, I don't know, I think you can absolutely love something and sometimes find it problematic at the same time. You can love something and find it to be difficult, and love something and disagree with it, which is, I think, at this point in the book, what we're doing.
Well, I think that the best part of this process is that when we spend so much time and energy like drilling down and polishing the things that we don't care for, it gives us more room to see the bright and shining bits of what we do care for. Like, I mean, really, truly, at the end of this chapter, while I have some thoughts later on about like how it's accomplished, I think that the way that we get to Diana's like palpable relief that Matthew has made this decision and coming back, like it's a really nice emotional moment. And I think that there is some good groundwork here for the people that they will become. And when we talk about, mostly in the next chapter, the conversation with Isabeau about how much they're both going to have to change in order to do this, I think that's all really great stuff. It's just that the pacing of it is odd, and I have difficulty, I think, with keeping the protagonist out of the engagement with the central narrative conflict in these chapters. Having some potentially false or sort of like weird conflict where this whole thing about the Knights of Lazarus feels like it's going to be a big deal, and then it's not really. And then the fact that I lost what I was saying. There was another thing.
We retcon the relationship things.
But retconning the relationship things for sure, but then there's also like a like the sort of weird loss of focus that we do that I think is the really tough part.
Yes. So at the end of the chapter, Matthew comes back, or we have the phone call in the middle of the night that says Matthew's coming back. Yay! Matthew's coming back. I think it's a nice emotional note as well. I think for me, for it to really, really land as an emotional note, and as we talked about a little bit in the last episode, he needs to be gone for longer for it to be like this level of emotion. And the only way I can kind of justify it in my head is that because of Diana's trauma, our level of connectedness is much, much higher and more acute than it would be normally in a relationship at this stage, with them only being separated for 48 hours at this point, right? So if I ignore that part, if I'm like, oh, it's been weeks or months, it's fine.
We do try to lay a bit of the groundwork for that just by talking with Sarah and Em about the relationship between Rebecca and Stephen and how quickly they were emotionally attached to one another and how quickly Em and Sarah fell in love. And if that's just the way that, generally, that is kind of the way that the series treats romantic attraction, like I don't know that in the course of the series we get anybody who like honestly dates. Basically, like, you find your person and then you're done. Like, you're mates for life. Which is great if you're swans.
People don't date
termites. Did you know that termites mate for life?
I did not, but thank you. I prefer that over swans, definitely.
Swans and wolves and
termites.
Right. Well, I have a print of animals that mate for life in our bedroom.
Doves and all those other things.
Bunches of things.
But the point is that creatures don't date around, evidently.
Right. And I think that I have less trouble swallowing that between Matthew and Diana, simply because that is how the series presents it for practically everyone. It doesn't bother me, I think, the same way that it bothers you, because I'm sort of like, okay, that's just the world we're in. Like, you find your magical person and your eyes meet and you threaten to hit them with an oar, and all of a sudden, like, that's your person.
Yeah. And it could just be like on a personal level, I'm excited to be by myself. I have a life partner and have been with him for over 10 years now, and they're definitely, even in the beginning of our relationship, I was like, it's cool, we don't have to like hang out, it's fine. And even now, I can go to Mexico for a month and have it be like It's great. It's fine. We'll talk on the phone when we have time, whatever. It's fine. So I guess like on a personal note, that has never been where any of my relationships have ever landed. And so it's difficult for me to be like, oh, of course there are people who feel that way about their relationships. And that's maybe fine. It's just not how I've ever felt about mine. So,
and I think it's worthwhile to talk about romantic fiction and the pretty common trope of sort of like all-consuming, sometimes destructive, all-encompassing love. You know, the fact that there is this like sort of intensity and burning passion, and you don't always have room in your life for other people or for other things. And I think that that's just something that I don't know if that has to do with romance as a genre, with what we expect from romance when we read it. Like the escape that we are looking for is a relationship that is all-encompassing, because the truth is that real, I would argue, like healthy relationships are not generally that way forever and ever and ever.
Thank God. This is exhausting.
Is this a thing that we have to play with? You know, would we have the romantic sweeping storyline if we said, all right, see you later, alligator? Like,
yeah, I mean,
I'll text you.
Obviously, it's something that an entire genre of fiction is built upon, but at the same time, you have to say, is it good? Is it healthy to be constantly portraying this type of romantic relationship, you know, as the only type of a romantic relationship? You know, how is that healthy for consumption all the time? Particularly since if you have a relationship with somebody, as we discussed last time, in the real world that is like this, it is not healthy or sustainable, really.
So, very brief digression. I was listening to NPR today, and there was a segment on TED Talks, and with the mathematician Hannah Fry about the mathematics of love. So, in the mathematics of love, Hannah Fry talks about how the statistically supported way to find your ideal mate is actually for you to, like, spend the first half of your dating life, or the first third, absolutely rejecting everyone you date, and that increases your likelihood of finding your perfect person by something like 20 factor 20. There we go. I can say that. So it's really remarkable that if you just say, nope, you're done, to the first third of everyone that you date in your lifetime, your odds of ending up with the statistically correct person are that much increased. And I found that to be very, very interesting. The downside, of course, being that what if the person that you reject in that first third is actually the person, quote unquote, for you? So I highly recommend listening to that TED Talk, because it was super, super interesting.
Do they determine first, third on like the average number of people you will eventually like date in your... Okay.
Correct. Saying that like most adults date like 24 people in their lifetime, starting from like the earliest dating age of like 13, 14, 15, you know, to like sort of the age when most people settle down, they will have been on dates with. And that doesn't mean like long-term like relationship. It means
or like a thing
having
or whatever.
Yep. And that if you reject the first 37% of them, you are most likely to end up with the right human, which I just think is really interesting that they solved for that. And so the TED Talk is all about like equations for like how love works, and it's really interesting. So recommended.
Well, I don't think that was off topic. That was definitely pertinent to the conversation. But it wasn't This would not be a podcast with us if we didn't go off topic at least once.
What do you think it is about this all-encompassing crazy person, sort of Matthew and Diana, Jamie and Claire, name another couple?
I don't have, not off the top of my head, I don't have, but yes, I see where you're going with this.
What do you think it is about that kind of romantic single-mindedness and dedication that is compelling for us as readers?
You mean like this are we talking like the love at first sight, you know, like passionate and like that portion?
Right. I mean, the intensity of love almost to the detriment of being able to function as a human being.
I think it I think it condenses all of the feelings that we very much enjoy feeling in a relationship, and kind of blows them up, you know, to like superhuman size, and continues them on for longer than many people might actually experience in long-term relationship. And because obviously, you know, romantic relationships, any relationship goes through phases, and the part that we, at least in Western culture, are particularly fixated with is the initial romantic passionate phase. That is not to say that relationships don't have many, many other phases, but the one that we really, really like in this culture is that one. And that's the one we tend to focus on the most. And so whether that's because we just like thinking about those feelings, or as a, you know, we particularly enjoy that part of a relationship and examining that part, and it kind of, you know, may bring back, you know, memories of times in relationships where we felt that way, and you know, enjoying those feelings more than other times in relationships, perhaps, is my thoughts on why, on the reasons that it continually pops up in popular culture, I guess. Yes, to me. What do you think?
I think there's something to that people are looking to recreate that moment of the first kiss, of the first anything, you know, and they're looking for the feeling of falling in love with a new person, which is, I think, for some people it is an exercise in just wanting to be able to feel that way all over again. For some people, I do think that it is a form of maintaining a healthy relationship with your existing partners by being able to explore. Like, I think there is a bit of like sort of emotional and experiential polyamory that goes on with like reading romances. And the sort of wish fulfillment aspect, I think, is a great deal of it. And I don't know that anybody actually looks at certain patterns in romance novels as a healthy way to have relationships, because many of them are just bumpy in terms of how they deal with things like emotional interdependence and violence, and like how you actually do day-to-day stuff with a partner. Because I admit, like, I don't know that I want to read about Matthew and Diana doing the laundry and the dishes. Like, that's not what I'm here for, right? Although, you know,
we read about Diana doing the laundry quite a lot in this book.
True, or not doing the laundry, as the case may be.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think we are particularly enthralled with, I guess, the thrill of those parts of the relationship. And, you know, previously in Western culture, we've been interested in other types of love, and other cultures are interested in other aspects of relationships. You know, previously in Western culture, we've had chivalric love, which is different than, you know, sexual and this kind of like passionate romantic love. And, you know, the ancient Romans and Greeks were particularly interested in friendship, so, you know, we go through phases, and right now we just love the passion and the romance and the sex.
And the, you know, grabbing your girlfriend's boob in front of your mother.
Right. Not something I would do in front of my mother-in-law or my mother. Yes. And
I trip over that paragraph every time, because we're like trotting along happily in steamy territory, and then all of a sudden Matthew like paws Diana's naughty parts it's not in public because they are at home, but like with Isabeau apparently watching dispassionately from the doorway. Yeah. And I'm just sort of like, Urgh.
In my head when I'm reading it, she went back in to grab a sweater and then came back out again. They come out to greet
but
him.
then she
goes to grab a sweater.
But then she comments on it, basically.
Yeah.
So, in any case, we have a moment of just sort of like spellbinding passion.
Very sexy.
And then we have this bit that really sort of like sticks in my craw.
Yeah. Which we can't talk about without being too spoilery yet, I guess.
No, I'm just going to flag this and say that when he says, "We are one from this moment forward, do you understand?" and she says, "I think so." I have all sorts of like expletive key strokes written right there, and period. Finn, we'll talk about it later, but
yeah, not to spoil anything, but
and like
I
Isabeau
think
touches
so.
on some of it. I'm sorry?
I think
maybe?
Kiss me again.
You kiss me again. I got that part. I got. I'm all over that, right? Yikes.
We're thinking with other parts.
We are thinking with other parts. We're thinking with
not
with
the big
hands-on
brain.
tatas is what we're thinking of. Oh man. So,
but
I don't know.
The amount of information, shall we just say, that is withheld and just like steamrolled over in this scene is astonishing by multiple characters, not just Matthew.
and that is one of the less successful retcons in a couple chapters, when, you know, like Isabeau's sort of abrupt surrender where she's just like, well, now the cat's out of the bag, and I've gone from like actively trying to prevent you two from being together to hitting my son for suggesting that perhaps I don't support this relationship. Number one, why do you think she hits him?
Oh, in 27? Is that in 27? Yeah. Because he's like, oh, should we leave? You know, blah, blah, blah. I don't know, because you're right. Like, we've literally spent all this time explaining to Diana why she doesn't like witches, and she doesn't like you, and she doesn't want Matthew to be in this relationship with you. And we spent all this time with her trying to like put Diana off of the relationship, essentially. And yeah. And we get essentially 180 to supportive mother. And like, how like, dare you think that about me? How could you possibly think that?
Because, I don't know, you've been kind of frigid for the last 3 chapters, and we're pretty clear about how you don't approve of this, so about that.
Yeah, and maybe it's just a nod to like, she's always going to be supportive of her son, and it's more like the support aspect and not their relationship itself that it's commenting on, but more like, of course I'm going to support you in like whatever you do kind of deal. That's how I make it more successful. It still doesn't work 100%. Well,
we sort of like glide right past it, you know, we do sort of like acrobatics to make it work. And then Isabeau decides that she's going to use her new position of approval to be like, well, now that Diana's part of the family, nudge, nudge, she's got to start behaving like, she says a witch, but I think the subtext is an adult.
Mm-hmm. Right. She has to, what is it, the great line where she's like, you know, pretending we're something that we're not, like Diana pretending she's a human, which is great and necessary for Diana, I think. Not that it necessarily pays off all that well in the immediate future in the book, but eventually we get there.
Well, I feel like we do a lot to sort of talk about like Diana's relationship with her identity without her actually really exploring or dealing with it. Like, I think that in the first book we just mostly spend time problematizing it, and we don't come to a place where she is like wholly comfortable in her identity, in all of her identity, until much, much later. But Isabeau being the one to bring it up is, I think, useful here, because Isabeau taking stock in and like sort of saying, no, the stakes of this relationship are now big enough to encompass all of us, and you can't just be locked in the tower, loving each other madly. Like, you have to deal with the rest of the world. I think that's a very useful counterpoint.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we get, Matthew's summary of like, while you were out, these things happened with me and the central conflict while I was gone, which is that somebody broke into the lab, but everything's fine. But they were looking for information on Diana and BT Dubs. They also broke into your apartment, and I was unable to get anywhere with Peter Knox or the congregation. So I came home because I love you. Which, of course, now was the primary reason for me leaving. It was always the reason. It was always the reason. I didn't leave for any other reason except to decide whether or not I love you. That is our excellent relationship retcon here in the middle of this chapter.
So I am curious to see whether in filming the TV series they decide to take us back to Oxford with Matthew. I think that it would help with the pacing. I think it would help with the conflict. And I actually think that it would help us explain and understand some of Matthew's motivations. And I don't necessarily, while I am not entirely sold on my conflicted feelings about you are totally the reason I left, I could see a version of this narrative where we spend more time with Matthew, where that's what it becomes while he's by himself, right? Like while he's wrestling with some of this. And I think that bumpiness could potentially be solved by actually spending the time with Matthew rather than futzing about in his library while he's gone. And that would be an interesting choice.
Yeah, and I mean, again, as we talked about in our previous reading block, like that is not the primary reason why he leaves. The primary reason he leaves is because of all the congregation stuff. And in these chapters, we're treating it as though it's the primary reason why he leaves, which is absolutely not. And you're right. In the TV show, there is definitely a way to kind of smooth that all over. And yeah.
Or at least tighten it, because the other thing this chapter seems like it's trying to do, right, is that Matthew is actually the one trying to bring it back to the central narrative conflict by talking about how if the intrusion into Diana's rooms is actually looking for her DNA, and if they're actually interested in finding out why the spell or why the book came for her and not for anybody else, and that this idea that she has been watched, right? And we already talked about Diana as hunted as opposed to huntress, and how that theme is important for her identity. And I think that it's actually like page 335, I guess, and 336, I actually think is one of the most successful points of this chapter, because all of a sudden everything is back in focus for a moment. Like we come back to this is about you, your relationship with the book, your relationship with me, and our relationship with all of those things in the wider world of other people who have questions about power and what else would you say?
I don't know. I guess I would just say power. Yeah. And I think too, it is actually a pretty subtle plant of a thread that we can follow through with Rebecca having Diana, destroy her DNA evidence essentially. And the fact that Rebecca has premonition and was renowned for being a seer, and we can definitely follow that through the entire series. For now, we make the assumption that, as Izzy Boo says, we don't want other witches to gain her DNA because her hair and her nails and stuff could have tremendous power for spells, which is totally reasonable thing to point out, and it makes sense textually and is logical that Rebecca would potentially do that. But I want us to also put it in our box of things that we're following through the entire series to talk about.
Oh, for sure. I'm not really sure why Diana treats like Isabeau with such astonishment that Isabeau knows this about witches. And it's like, She is, I mean, textually, she's older than Matthew by like a good deal. So she's probably 2,000 years old at like the very least. And Diana sort of like subjectively imposes upon Isabeau this whole like, well, I don't know anything about the world of creatures, so maybe you don't know anything either. Like, you know more about witches than me. Well, you, my dear, have been like intentionally walling yourself off from any knowledge of your people or their stuff. So you're lucky you had a mother with some foresight.
I mean, yeah, we can count on, two hands the things you do know about creatures. So I guess that could be a bit of denial as well, that, I can see it as her trying to make it okay that she knows so little by convincing herself that others also know very little about members of other species. So, and, but I do like that everyone's like, no. She's known a lot of witches. She's been around for a while. She herself had potentially not, if not powers, at least she had abilities prior to becoming a vampire. Like, she knows a lot about witches. She has a lot of experience.
I like that Matthew thanks Isabeau for saving Diana's life. I like that as an olive branch. Both that Isabeau is the one to take care of Diana, which we already talked about, but then that Matthew has the decency to recognize that that is a thing that I think he suspects came from within Isabeau, that it was a thing she did for him, but it was also a thing that she did because it had to be done.
Just for herself, because she's decent. Yeah. Shall we go hunting with Matthew?
We shall, after like sort of a moment of squeeing that this is the first time that we get Matthew in anything that isn't like new clothing. He actually has like worn pajamas.
Worn pajamas. Which I like that, because the pajamas should be the comfiest part of your wardrobe, and worn clothing is, automatically more comfy than new clothing. So
yeah, and I actually think that, I'm not super into the trope of vampire fiction where it's like, well, I'll just sit here and watch you sleep, but I can totally...
Which he does say.
He does say, and then he says,
God.
I'll read. Right? I mean, like, it's... So that sort of homely bit I can get behind, and it doesn't totally solve the like creepy watching thing, but at least like it follows through on the other thread that we've had, which is like that Diana sleeps all the time with Matthew present, and he goes off and does sort of his own thing most of the time. I can buy it, I think, in this instance only because they're sort of like newly committed to this relationship, and that it's not something that like reappears.
Right. Yeah.
Still not my favorite.
No. But I do like it, though. I like their chemistry. I think as characters, they do have a great deal of chemistry with each other. And now that they've decided to be together, we can actually do the, romantic things to some extent.
We can have sleepovers.
We can have jammies and making out in bed, because that's all that we get so far.
Right. And then we go hunting. What do we think of Diana's decision to be like, no, I'm gonna like force this like really potentially dangerous situation. I'm just gonna force the question.
On the one hand, I think it's a little naive of her. Like, she still doesn't know all the things that she doesn't know. So she is still being a bit reckless, and is a bit naive of her to be like, I've been hunting with exactly one vampire. I can now go hunting with all the vampires, including Matthew, and it's fine. That is a bit naive. I do think that it's important for us to kick Matthew out of his like dark and mysterious vampire world a bit, and just kind of like get over this. We have other things we have to deal with. Let's move on. So I like it in that respect.
Well, and the fact that it forces him to stop being self-pitying and self-loathing about something that really is part of who he is, and that is eating. From the descriptions that we have had of what it looks like when a vampire is hungry, like that the veins are darker and, the pupils and this, that, and the other, like he's hungry. He's actually hungry. And having a partner who forces you to like attend to the basics is an element of like a supportive and emotionally healthy relationship, and saying, no, you do need to sleep. You do need to feed yourself. You do need to do the basics of maintaining the only body that you have.
Yeah, it's important in relationships. I mean, I have certainly been in places where I'm like literally crying because I'm hungry, and my husband is like, eat the food. He like put something in front of me, like, put it in your mouth, put it in your mouth right now. And I'm like crying and like, okay, I'll just like sit here and eat this thing, because you lose your mind, basically.
And it's sort of, I hadn't thought about it super hard until now, but I mean, it is a way to look at some of Matthew's somewhat erratic emotional responses during the first half of this book. As part of it is because he's not taking good care of himself, and he's hungry. Like, he's literally in a state of physical distress from lack of nourishment and lack of exercise and lack of all the things that we later learned that he just needs more of.
There is such a thing as hangry, but there's also such a thing as just like becoming a nutcase, like a basket case, because you don't eat, and just like making really terrible emotional decisions and just being like bananas when you're hungry. Not just hangry, but like all of the spectrum of emotions. We are hunting. While I think there are a couple of problematic comments that happen while we are hunting, overall, I think it's fairly successful in what it does for their relationship overall in this chapter. What do you think of it, just like as a device?
I think the most successful treatment of it is when Diana really drills down on the idea that this is about fear. About his fear of himself, and about she's also afraid of, to some extent, afraid of him, but she has to, like, they have to know. They can't be in a relationship where he is afraid to take care of himself because of the danger it will pose to her, and they both have to know that he can do this. So I think that is actually the most successful part of it for me. And, sort of, I'm not sure how successful it is for me that Diana tries to paint herself as being also dangerous, even though her dangerousness is increasing because her power is sort of going haywire and she has no control over it. And I think it's a little bit different, and trying to spin it that way to make him comfortable is sort of a noble emotional gesture, but I'm not sure how honest it is, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it does work for me, that a specific thing of having like two essentially dangerous creatures in a relationship, like equally dangerous creatures in a relationship together, works for me. I think at this point in their relationship, it's not necessarily true because Diana can't control herself. So she's really only dangerous in the sense that she has no control over what's going to happen next with her. But that's a different kind of danger. And I think later on it is more successful when they are more equally measured up against each other in terms of like skill and ability, I'll just say.
when she finally levels up her own
yes
self.
Exactly. Yes, her creature abilities level up. So the main problem I have with this scene, and it's small and it's something we've talked about before, is her comment where she's like eating a cheese sandwich and she's like, oh, it's exactly the same, when we know that vampires eat humans, and that is not the same as a cheese sandwich at all. Do you think, and this was a thought I was having yesterday when I was reviewing this chapter, to me, if the vampires in this world that we're in only fed on animals, in the sense that they only fed on like not demons, not witches, not humans, only other mammals, that it would work for me. If they only drank the blood of like other animals, that would be fine for me, because because we have them feeding on humans, that comment is it just like whirls off base for me, and is obviously something we've talked about before that we keep ignoring, and I'm like, it's not working. Yeah, like you can turn another human into a vampire, obviously, but you don't actually eat humans. That would be okay for me in this world if vampires only drank animal blood. That would be fine. I'd be fine with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I think it's more interesting, I do think that one of the more successful aspects of the Twilight series is the idea of having there be conflict between vampires that choose to eat the blood of humans versus vampires who choose to eat the blood of only animals, and what kind of set of ethics that presents for vampires. I don't think that it's executed terribly well in that other Sparkle series. I do think that in this series it would add a layer of texture that would be interesting, but I've also never understood, in an age where there are blood banks, why do they have to hunt?
We could go the Buffy route and just have them go to like the butcher shop or the or the hospital or the blood bank and have this whole, network of like blood donation, or them, taking blood from the blood. We could absolutely
and having,
because it's a modern world.
Having the vampires be omnivorous, I think, is an interesting choice that we make over the course of the series. But there are times when it sort of like bumps into itself, and I think that this might be one of them. And that's just because we never address squarely, who Matthew eats, right? When and why he chooses, if he can subsist upon the blood of a stag, why does he ever choose? And that's a much more complicated question, is like, why would you choose that when you know what it means?
We definitely hint at the reason throughout the series, but the points at which Matthew eats something other than, for example, a deer or a rabbit, we just completely ignore the other thing that he happens to be feeding on.
Well, we also play later on with the idea that vampires can eat from a warm blood and not kill them, right? Which begs the question of why they
I think we talk about it a little bit in this book as well. Like a teensy mention, yeah.
So why would you ever make the decision to actually extinguish a life of a human if you could feed on them without doing so?
Or why would you feed on them at all if you can just eat a deer? I don't know. Anyway, the point is, not the same as a cheese sandwich. Thanks, Diana.
I do, as just a little tiny note on the side there, I love the description that Mart likes to get her blood from brawnier creatures, like the idea of like
longshoremen and bodybuilders.
And pirates. I love that. I love that she's like, nope, I would like beefcake, please.
You go, girl. Yes.
And I do think that we do some good attempts at personal growth in this chapter, in terms of being honest about actual fears and saying, okay, well, maybe I don't have to try and, put myself between you and the scary things in the world. Maybe you can handle them yourself. He's not he's not entirely good at holding to that for the rest of this book, but at least Matthew does recognize that Diana is not, to the extent that he's treated her as being weak or defenseless, he is, I think, not paying attention to the parts of her that are actually weak. And he's ascribing a lot of characteristics to her that she doesn't actually possess.
Do we have more to say on these chapters?
So we have gotten some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful emails from you guys over the course of the last couple weeks. We are so sorry that we didn't respond to them very quickly. It was the holiday season,
drowning,
and things
so
got out of hand. So for those of you who emailed us or texted us or otherwise got in touch, we have really, really enjoyed reading your emails, and we love the amount of effort that you put into every response you send us. It really lights up my life.
And you guys are all very thoughtful, and those of you who have emailed us are, as in-depth in the text as we are being, which is great and wonderful, and we love it, and thank you. So we have just 3 notes that we wanted to pull in from some of our listener feedback. The first, I guess, and the quickest one was just some commentary that we had when we were talking about the TV show a few episodes ago. And it was just some follow-up to that, which is that we had hypothesized about which episodes they were done filming and, which blocks they were in, etc. And just to, note that we don't have any insider information on things. We do follow everybody on Twitter and Instagram, and that's where we get our information. But that additionally, just the note that in television, sometimes they film things out of order just because of actor availability or location or whatever, so they're not necessarily filming in the order that in which things happen in the book. So whether it's with Matthew and Diana or other characters, whatever, bringing them in at different times, and obviously we have no insider information on that either, so we just kind of like tend to speculate on things heavily.
What is a podcast for if not for wild speculation?
So, but just, thank you to the listener who had brought that up, and you're absolutely right. They could do any order they want to for any reason that works for their production, so we just follow the photos and try to figure out what it is that they're doing. So, yes. What else do we have?
We had an email about the nature of representation in the All Souls trilogy from a reader who was also similarly piqued in terms of curiosity and wondering about the wider world of creatures and why there are not more, say, characters of color or more exploration of the permutations of race and nationality, etc., and identity within the All Souls trilogy universe, which is very interesting. And the reader brought up this layer that I hadn't even considered before, where everything that we know of the congregation, it sounds like a very sort of European and very Western take on like how things ought to be done, and it sounds both very paternalistic and also super colonialist. And I hadn't really thought about that in terms of what it means for creature relations to be governed by a body that sits in one place and then just sort of like sends out its feelers elsewhere, and where one group of people makes a decision or makes decisions for another group of people who are not co-located with them and maybe don't share their thoughts, feelings, or needs. So I thought that was a really interesting and great read that is going to add nuance and complexity to my understanding of this series, and I have lots of questions about that.
Right. And it's something that I had thought about before, and one of the points she brought up was that, perhaps there are in fact congregations in other continents around the world, which is something I had considered before, because I was like, having one congregation for the entire world and they're in Venice, like you're right, it is very colonial, and it would add an interesting layer if there was, for example, a congregation in Africa, if there was a congregation, in the Americas somewhere, if there was one in Asia somewhere, and having that extra texture to all of those places that are very different from Europe, and may have very different views on how things ought to be run. Is there a congregation there, or do they govern themselves in a different way, the creatures who live there? So it's definitely something I've speculated about.
Well, and then the layer of, has the congregation suffered from the same, say, representational infirmities as other governing bodies through history? I mean, did the congregation start as like all European dudes from, say, France and England sitting around a table, like thumping their tankards and pushing out their chests and saying, we know how things should be? And has there ever been a discussion about representation and about democracy? I think we sort of allude to the idea that the world of creatures is undergoing a revolutionary period just by talking about how different Marcus is from his father and from people that came before. I mean, I think that is a very interesting and worthy discussion that we haven't had yet. And while we widen the aperture, I think as we get to book 3, there are still a lot of questions about the nature of the congregation and its origins, and whether it really does speak for all creatures, or whether that was just imposed upon everyone at the behest of a bunch of creature dudes.
Right. And this listener also brought up the point that actually, like, a lot of European countries now are very diverse, particularly, France, where a lot of this story takes place, and, other countries, Spain. I mean, you get the Moorish influence in a lot of, and African influence in a lot of the more Southern European countries. And so why aren't there more people? Why don't we have more characters of color? And so I thought it was a really, really a good point, and thank you to that person for their thoughts and insights on that.
We had another email that talked about sort of the nature of female characters and patriarchy in vampire societies. And I think that there is a longer, deeper conversation that we can have about the construction and performance of femininity in the All Souls trilogy that is way too long for the podcast length we are currently experiencing. We can do that later. But it was an interesting point. The reader pointed out that, we talk about, say, Isabeau being so strong and this, that, and the other. And it begs the question of why Isabeau isn't the head of the de Clermont family. Why don't we see in this book or in other places that female leadership in places of creature power?
Right. And because particularly with the vampires, the female vampires assumedly inherit when they become vampires the same special abilities and powers and strengths that male vampires would get. So why can't they? I mean, on the witch side, you do have that matrilineage. So you do have, the witches seeming to be much more female led than the vampires are, but there's no reason why female vampires can't be heads of vampire families like from a strength perspective.
And I do think that there's something that the book is trying to do that is very specifically thematic, right, in terms of duality and male, female, light, dark, good, evil, justice, revenge. Like, there are some very specific choices I think that the text is making in terms of presenting things as opposites or as being like artificially balanced when maybe we would prefer to see them treated differently. But I think that I don't know if there's a world of All Souls fan fiction, but there probably ought to be. And I think there need to be some vampire heads of household that are lady people. That would be really nice.
Yeah. And our third little piece of that was all three, was it?
Yeah.
Those three. Yay, I can count.
Yeah, I think those are the ones that we wanted to pick up on.
Yes. Yeah. And you're all we very much enjoyed reading your feedback. So, and your thoughts. Because the female vampire heads of households thing I had not considered, but you're absolutely right.
Yes. You're wonderful and smart, and we love you. We want to hear more from you.
Yes. And we shall continue with our next episode, which will be chapters 28, 29, 30. Yes? So we'll be moving past this difficult, sticky part of the book.
Yes. We will absolutely be moving into where the pacing of the book actually starts to pick up again in a really major way. And there's some great stuff in the next couple chapters. So I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you and hearing from you guys about what you think. So in the meantime, you can find us at Chamomile and Clovecast at gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter. Chamomile in is in November Clove.
Yep, and you can also find us on our website, of course, which is chamomileandclovecast.wordpress.com, which is where we put all of our episodes and extra information, and our reading schedule is also up there, and release schedule in case you ever want to check up on that. So until next time, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Bye.